The rain falling on Harlem that November night in 1964 did not wash the streets clean. It just made the shadows slicker, deeper, and colder. It was the kind of freezing, unrelenting downpour that drove the honest folks into their warm apartments, forced the beat cops to huddle under awning covers, and left the desolate avenues to the hustlers, the stray dogs, and the ghosts. Water pooled in the uneven concrete of 125th Street, deep enough to swallow a man's shoe, reflecting the bleeding red and blue neon signs of the late-night joints that refused to surrender to the storm. A black Lincoln Continental glided down Lenox Avenue like a shark navigating a dark reef. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt, cutting through the standing water with a heavy, purposeful sound. Inside the cavernous back seat, enveloped in the soft embrace of crushed leather and cigar smoke, sat Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The city knew him simply as Bumpy. He watched the blurred shapes of the neighborhood slide past the rain-streaked window. Bumpy possessed a mind that never truly rested. It was a calculating engine, always processing the angles, the debts, the shifting allegiances of the uptown underworld. The Italian families downtown were always testing the borders. The local upstarts were always looking for a weakness to exploit, and the police were always waiting for a mistake. But Bumpy did not make mistakes. He survived Alcatraz. He survived the razor-wielding thugs of his youth, and he survived the politicians by remaining 3 steps ahead of the board. Tonight, however, the ledger in his mind was temporarily closed. Tonight, he sought sanctuary. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit constructed from English wool that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. His white shirt was starched stiff, his silk tie caught the faint, passing glow of the streetlights, and his signature fedora rested neatly on the seat beside him. He looked like a titan of industry, which, in his own ruthless way, he was. In the driver's seat, silent as a tombstone, sat Junie Bard. Junie did not need instructions. He drove the massive Lincoln with the precision of a surgeon, his massive hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Junie was a man forged in violence, fiercely loyal, and terrifyingly efficient. He was the shadow that followed the King of Harlem, the muscle that ensured Bumpy's quiet commands echoed like thunder in the streets. They had been riding in silence for 20 minutes, the only sound the rhythmic thumping of the heavy windshield wipers batting away the freezing rain. "Pull over on the next block, Junie," Bumpy said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute attention without ever needing to raise its volume. The golden clef. Junie gave a single, slight nod. He didn't ask why the boss of the numbers racket wanted to visit a subterranean fading jazz lounge on a Tuesday night in the middle of a monsoon. He simply engaged the turn signal and brought the heavy car to a smooth halt next to a flooded curb. The golden clef was a relic. It was a narrow, velvet-lined cavern that had seen its golden age during the roaring 1940s. Back then, it was a place where sharp-dressed cats and elegant women sipped imported champagne. Now it survived on the fringes, its velvet seats threadbare, its brass fixtures tarnished, catering to a clientele that preferred dim lighting and the comforting anonymity of the dark. Junie killed the engine. He reached into his long, dark trench coat, his fingers briefly brushing the heavy caliber pistol resting in his shoulder holster, a habit born of endless caution, before pushing his door open into the storm. He walked around the rear of the Lincoln, his massive frame shielding the passenger door from the wind, and opened it for his boss. Bumpy stepped out, placing his fedora squarely on his head. He did not rush. Even in the freezing downpour, Bumpy Johnson moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. Men who rush look afraid, and Bumpy feared nothing that walked on two legs. They approached the entrance, a set of heavy wooden doors leading down a steep flight of stairs. The neon sign above flickered violently, the word golden buzzing with an angry electrical wasp sound, while Clef remained completely dark. A shivering doorman, wearing a worn-out uniform coat 2 sizes too large, stood huddled under the small awning. When he saw who was approaching, the man's posture instantly straightened, his shivering replaced by a rigid, terrified respect. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," the doorman stammered, rushing to pull the heavy door open. "Terrible night for a stroll, sir." Bumpy did not look at the man. He simply offered a low murmur of acknowledgement, slipping a crisp $5 bill from his pocket and pressing it into the doorman's freezing hand without breaking his stride. The man gasped softly at the generous tip, holding the door wide as Bumpy and Junie descended into the belly of the club. The air inside was thick enough to carve with a switchblade. It smelled of damp wool coats, cheap gin, stale tobacco smoke, and the sharp, sweet tang of bay rum. The lighting was impossibly low, a deliberate choice to hide the water stains on the ceiling and the scuff marks on the hardwood floor. There were perhaps 15 people scattered throughout the room, a few couples huddled in booths, a trio of weary men at the bar nursing watered-down whiskey, and a lone waitress leaning against the back wall, looking exhausted. Bumpy navigated the room with practiced ease, heading straight for the deepest, darkest corner booth located in the far back. It was a position of tactical superiority. From that booth, enveloped entirely in shadows, he could see the front door, the back office, the bar, and the stage, while remaining virtually invisible to anyone walking in. He slid into the leather seat. Junie did not sit. He took his position exactly 3 feet behind Bumpy's right shoulder, blending into the dark mahogany, paneling like a wraith. Junie didn't drink on the job. He rarely blinked. He just watched the room with flat, dead eyes, his hands resting casually inside the deep pockets of his trench coat. A young bartender, recognizing the silent, looming figure of Junie Bird from the corner of his eye, practically sprinted from behind the bar. He arrived at the table with a clean tray, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Johnson, what an absolute honor," the kid said, swallowing hard. "What can I bring you, sir?" "The house is buying." "Cognac," Bumpy said softly, his eyes already drifting toward the small, elevated wooden stage at the front of the room. "Neat. Leave the bottle." The kid scurried away, desperate to fulfill the order. Bumpy settled into the shadows. He had not come here to conduct business. He had come because his soul felt heavy, weighed down by the endless friction of the streets, and he needed a specific kind of medicine. He had come for the music. Up on the small stage, bathed in a single, dusty yellow spotlight that cut through the cigarette smoke like a physical beam, sat a man who possessed a magic that Bumpy deeply respected. His name was Elias Thorne. The neighborhood called him Blind Elias. Elias was a frail, elderly black man whose frame looked as though it might shatter if a strong wind caught him on the avenue. He wore a faded, threadbare tuxedo that had likely been stylish when Duke Ellington was playing the Cotton Club, but was now shiny at the elbows, frayed at the cuffs, and smelling faintly of mothballs. A pair of thick, black sunglasses covered his sightless eyes. A scarred, heavy wooden walking cane leaned against the side of his piano bench. To a casual observer, Elias was a broken-down relic playing for pennies in a dying club. But when Elias Thorne placed his long, calloused arthritis-gnarled fingers on the yellowed ivory keys of the upright piano, his frailty vanished completely. He didn't just play the instrument, he commanded it. He spoke to it, coaxing secrets out of the wood and wire. Tonight, he was playing a slow, mournful jazz ballad. His hands moved with a fluid, liquid grace that defied his age and his brittle bones. The music wept through the smoky room. It was a beautiful, aching sound that bypassed the ears and sank directly into the marrow. He played with the collective sorrow, the exhausted triumphs, and the quiet dignities of 50 years of living in the dark. The bartender returned silently, placing a crystal glass and a dusty bottle of imported French cognac on the table. Bumpy poured himself a measure. He lifted the glass, letting the rich, amber aroma fill his senses, and took a slow sip. The liquor burned a warm, comforting path down his chest, but his attention never wavered from the stage. The music reminded him of his wife, Mamie. Mamie was a queen, a woman of unparalleled grace, fierce intelligence, and quiet strength. She was the bedrock upon which Bumpy built his empire, the only person in the world who could look the king of Harlem in the eye and tell him he was wrong. Mamie loved jazz. She understood the architecture of the music. She had taught Bumpy how to truly listen to it, how to hear the spaces between the notes, how to recognize the quiet moments of defiance buried inside a sad song. Whenever Bumpy heard a piano played with such profound soul, it made him want to leave the blood and the dirt of the rackets behind, go home to his warm apartment, and sit beside her. Elias hit a complex, descending minor chord that seemed to hang suspended in the humid air, vibrating with an intense, tragic beauty. He let the chord resonate, holding the sustain pedal down until the sound slowly, agonizingly faded into the damp, peeling walls of the club. He lifted his hands from the keys. He bowed his head slightly, his chin resting near his chest as the final echo died away. The applause from the scattered patrons was thin but respectful. A few people snapped their fingers. A couple in a nearby booth clapped softly. Bumpy did not clap. He simply raised his glass of cognac toward the stage in a silent, solitary salute to a master of his craft. Elias smiled a warm, genuine smile. It was a smile that reached past his dark glasses and illuminated his weathered face. He reached out, his hands feeling blindly through the empty air until his fingertips brushed the polished wood of his heavy cane. He gripped it tightly, using it to leverage his aching bones up from the piano bench. He stood tall, adjusting his faded tuxedo jacket with a quiet, practiced dignity, and began to tap his way toward the edge of the small stage. It was at that exact moment that the atmosphere in the room began to curdle. The fragile peace created by the music was shattered by the sound of swinging doors violently kicking open. From the back office emerged the owner of the Golden Clef. His name was Sal Vance, but the street hustlers called him Slick Sal, and it was not meant as a compliment. Sal was a man who tried desperately to project an image of wealth, power, and sophisticated danger, but only managed to exude an aura of cheap sleaze. Sal wore a suit that was an offensive, overly bright shade of blue. The lapels were excessively wide, practically touching his shoulders, and the fabric shone under the dim lights with the unnatural sheen of cheap synthetic fibers. His thinning hair was plastered flat to his scalp with a heavy dose of foul-smelling, floral pomade. A thick, ostentatious gold chain, which Junie Bird could have spotted as a brass fake from 50 yards away, rested over his dark, unbuttoned shirt, nestling in a bed of chest hair. Sal was a bottom feeder. He was a parasite who preyed on the desperate. He was known for shortchanging his waitresses, watering down the liquor until it tasted like tap water, and treating anyone he deemed beneath him like dirt on the bottom of his two-tone wingtip shoes. He was a bully, a coward who only felt tall when he was forcing someone else to their knees. He was exactly the kind of man Bumpy Johnson despised, a man who took from the community without offering respect in return. Bumpy watched from the impenetrable shadows of his booth, his dark eyes narrowing fractionally as Sal strutted across the main floor. Sal held a thick, heavy glass of scotch in one hand and a lit, cheap cigar in the other. He was laughing loudly at a joke only he found funny, his voice grating, harsh, and entirely out of rhythm with the mood of the room. He slapped a patron on the back too hard, causing the man to spill his drink, and didn't even bother to apologize. Elias tapped his cane carefully, navigating the 3 small, uneven wooden steps down from the stage. He moved slowly, relying on spatial memory and the hollow echo of the floorboards beneath his cane. He made his way toward the long mahogany bar, his head tilted slightly, listening for the familiar sounds of the room to guide him. "Mr. Vance?" Elias called out, his voice raspy with age but deeply polite. "Mr. Vance, sir, are you out there?" Sal Vance stopped his strutting. He turned slowly, looking at the blind pianist with a sneer of profound, undisguised disgust. He looked at Elias as if the elderly man were a stray, diseased dog that had wandered out of the rain and muddied his pristine floor. Sal took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly against the glass, letting the silence stretch out to make Elias uncomfortable. "Yeah, I'm here, old man," Sal said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "What do you want? You're interrupting my drink, and I don't like being interrupted." Elias stopped a few feet away, his cane resting firmly on the floorboards. He offered a respectful, deferential nod. "I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Vance. It's just that my set is finished for the night. We agreed on 3 hours, and by my internal clock, it's past 2 in the morning. I was just hoping to collect my pay so I can catch the night bus back to my room before this storm gets any worse." Sal took a slow, deep drag of his cigar. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and deliberately blew a thick cloud of acrid gray smoke directly into Elias's face. Elias coughed, a dry, rattling sound in his frail chest. He turned his head away slightly, trying to wave the smoke away from his nose, but he did not step back. He maintained his composure. He stood straight, gripping his cane, waiting for his due. "Your pay," Sal repeated, rolling the 2 words around in his mouth like a bad piece of meat. He looked around the half-empty club, gesturing expansively with his scotch glass, intentionally splashing a few drops of liquor onto the floor near Elias's shoes. "You want to get paid for that funeral dirge you were just playing? Are you out of your mind? Look around, blind man. The place is a graveyard. Nobody was drinking to that depressing noise. You put half my paying crowd to sleep and drove the other half out into the freezing rain. The arrangement was $30 for the evening, Mr. Vance," Elias said. His voice remained incredibly calm, holding on to his dignity like a shield, though a slight tremor of anxiety betrayed his polite facade. "We shook hands on it in your office. I played the songs you requested. I kept the tempo steady. I kept my end of the bargain. You kept your end of the bargain?" Sal barked, letting out a harsh, ugly sound that was half laugh, half growl. He stepped even closer to Elias, aggressively invading the elderly man's personal space. Sal was a large man, soft and heavy around the middle, and he routinely used his physical bulk to intimidate those smaller than him. I'll tell you what the bargain is, Elias. The bargain is you play music that makes people thirsty. You play upbeat, fast jive that makes people want to buy my overpriced liquor and stay all night. You didn't do that. You played a bunch of sad, slow, pathetic wailing that made everybody want to go home and write a suicide note. From his corner booth, enveloped in total darkness, Bumpy Johnson did not move a single muscle. He did not breathe heavily. He did not speak, but the temperature in the dark corner seemed to instantaneously drop 10 degrees. The air grew heavy, charged with invisible static. Junie Byard felt the shift. It was a primal, instinctual change in the atmosphere. Junie slowly, silently shifted his weight. It was a movement so slight it was nearly imperceptible to the human eye, but Bumpy felt it. Junie's right hand drifted a fraction of an inch closer to the lapel of his coat. Junie was waiting for the nod. One nod, and Sal Vance would be dragged into the alley and beaten until he couldn't remember his own middle name. But Bumpy held up a single, subtly gloved finger. Wait. He wanted to see exactly how far this fool was going to take it. He wanted to see the full, unvarnished measure of Sal Vance's character. In Bumpy's world, a man's true nature was revealed not when he was shaking hands, but when he held all the power over someone who had none. Elias gripped his scarred cane tighter. His knuckles were pale against the dark wood. "Mr. Vance, I have rent to pay on Friday. I need to buy groceries tomorrow. I sat at that bench for 3 hours and I earned that money. Please, let's not have a misunderstanding. Just pay me what we agreed upon, and I will be on my way into the night." Sal laughed again. It was a cruel, braying sound that echoed off the damp ceiling. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his cheap blue suit and pulled out a thick silver money clip. It was stuffed tight with bills, deliberately folded over multiple times to look like 10 times more money than it actually was. Sal peeled off a single, crumpled $10 bill. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do, old man. Because I have a bleeding heart, and because it's raining cats and dogs out there, I'm going to give you $10. That's $10 more than you deserve for that absolute garbage performance, but I'm feeling charitable tonight. Consider it a tip for showing up." Elias frowned, his sightless eyes hidden behind the dark lenses, his brow furrowing in deep distress. $10? "Mr. Vance, the agreement was $30. I cannot live on $10 for a full night's work. It costs me $1 just for the bus fare." "Take it or leave it," Ray Charles, Sal sneered, maliciously using the famous musician's name as a weapon of disrespect. He held the crumpled $10 bill out in the air, dangling it carelessly just a few inches from Elias's face, treating the old man like a dancing monkey. Elias swallowed his pride. He had no choice. The cold reality of poverty outweighed the luxury of indignation. He reached out a trembling, age-spotted hand, trying to locate the paper in the empty space before him. His fingers awkwardly brushed against Sal's thick, hairy wrist. "Watch the suit," Sal chided, pulling his hand back sharply with exaggerated disgust. A sadistic, twisted grin spread across his greasy face. He looked over at the young bartender, who was watching the exchange with wide, fearful eyes, terrified to intervene. Sal winked at the kid, performing for his captive audience. Sal held the bill up again, moving it slightly to the left. "Come on, Elias. You want to eat tomorrow? You want your $10? Take it." Elias sighed, a sound of deep, profound exhaustion. He reached out again, stepping forward, his hand swiping at the empty air. Just as Elias's fingers were about to close around the paper, Sal deliberately opened his grip. He dropped the $10 bill. It fluttered in the smoky, stale air, drifting left and right on the invisible currents of the room, before finally drifting down to land in a filthy puddle of spilled dark beer and melted ice on the sticky wooden floorboards. "Oops," Sal mocked, his voice feigning clumsy, theatrical innocence. "Slipped right through my butterfingers. Looks like you're going to have to find it yourself down there, old man." Elias froze. He stood perfectly still, his hands still suspended in the empty air. The humiliation hung in the room, heavy, toxic, and suffocating. The few remaining patrons in the club looked away. A man at a booth suddenly found his empty glass fascinating. A couple near the stage whispered frantically to each other, ashamed to watch but entirely too afraid of Sal's unpredictable temper to stand up and say a word. The silence in the club was absolute, broken only by the steady, unrelenting drumming of the rain against the roof and the low, buzzing hum of the neon sign bleeding through the walls. Slowly, agonizingly, Elias Thorne began to bend down. His aged, arthritic knees popped audibly in the quiet room, a sharp cracking sound that sounded like breaking twigs. He used his heavy wooden cane to steady himself as he lowered his frail, trembling body toward the filthy, sticky floor. His hands, the very same hands that had just created a masterpiece of jazz, the hands that carried the legacy of Harlem's musical soul, patted blindly at the wet wood. He felt through the spilled liquor, the cigarette ash, and the accumulated grime of 100 careless nights, desperately searching for the single crumpled bill. Sal Vance stood towering over him. He took another long, slow sip of his scotch, his chest puffed out in arrogant, hollow triumph. He looked down at the blind man reduced to crawling on his knees, and he chuckled, a wet, disgusting sound. "Watch your hands down there, Elias," Sal said smoothly. "Some clumsy square broke a highball glass over there earlier. I didn't get around to sweeping it up. Wouldn't want you to slice up those magic piano fingers of yours on a jagged edge." In the back booth, the shadow finally moved. Bumpy Johnson slowly placed his crystal glass of cognac down on the wooden table. He didn't slam it. He didn't spill a single drop. He didn't make a sound. But the quiet, unhurried precision of the movement was infinitely more terrifying than a shouted threat or a drawn weapon. He picked up his fedora. He placed it carefully on his head, adjusting the brim with exactly 2 fingers so that it cast a sharp, dark, diagonal line over his eyes, hiding them in shadow. He had seen enough. The jury of one had deliberated, the evidence had been weighed, and the verdict was final. Bumpy looked up at Junie Bird. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Junie didn't say a word. He didn't draw the pistol. He didn't crack his knuckles. He simply detached his massive frame from the wall and began to glide through the room. Junie moved with the silent, predatory grace of a great white shark navigating deep, dark water. He bypassed the bar entirely and walked straight over to the first booth, where the couple was trying desperately to pretend they were invisible. Junie stopped. He leaned down, placing his huge hands flat on their table. His face was a mask of cold, unfeeling stone. He leaned his head close to the man's ear. "Drink up, cat," Junie whispered. His voice sounded like dry gravel grinding against a tombstone. "The club is closed." The man looked up, startled, his face flushing with sudden anger. He opened his mouth to protest, ready to complain that his glass was still half full and he had paid a cover charge. But then his eyes met Junie Bard's. The man stopped breathing. He saw the void in Junie's eyes. He saw the complete, absolute absence of hesitation, mercy, or human warmth. The man swallowed the lump in his throat, instantly grabbed his wet coat, pulled his frightened date by the arm, and practically ran for the front door, leaving a $5 bill floating on the spilled water on the table. Junie did not watch them leave. He moved effortlessly to the next table. 3 older men were playing a quiet, low-stakes game of cards, trying to ignore the drama at the bar. Junie didn't even lean in this time. He just stood over them, casting a massive shadow, and tapped the edge of the wooden table twice with his heavy knuckles. "Knock, knock." "Beat it," Junie said, the command flat and absolute. "Now." The men scrambled. They didn't grab their change. They didn't finish their hands. They grabbed their hats, leaving their playing cards and small stacks of chips scattered across the felt. They didn't look back. They knew the unspoken code of the Harlem streets. When a man like Junie Bird tells you to leave a room, you do not ask questions. You do not ask for a refund. You do not speak. You simply vanish into the night, and you pray to whatever God you believe in that he forgets your face. Within 90 seconds, the club was entirely empty of civilian life. The young bartender was standing behind the mahogany counter, shaking so violently he was rattling the cocktail glasses on the glass shelf behind him. He looked like he was about to faint. Junie walked slowly up to the bar. He looked at the kid, his face completely devoid of expression. Junie slowly jerked his right thumb toward the swinging wooden doors that led to the back alley exit. "Take a walk, son," Junie said softly, almost gently. "Don't stop walking until you hit Lenox Avenue, and forget everything you saw." The kid didn't need to be told twice. He ripped his white apron off, threw it onto the wet floor, and bolted through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The sound of his frantic footsteps faded rapidly as he burst out into the alley and into the safety of the storm. Sal Vance was so intoxicated by his own pathetic power trip, and the howling storm outside was so loud that he remained entirely oblivious to the mass exodus happening just behind his back. He was still standing over Elias, thoroughly enjoying his moment. Elias was still on his hands and knees, his trembling fingers finally brushing against the wet, sticky texture of the crumpled $10 bill. Sal was busy using a gold-plated lighter to spark up a fresh cigar, puffing out thick, obnoxious clouds of smoke, completely unaware that his little kingdom had just been systematically evacuated. In the back corner, Bumpy Johnson stood up from his booth. He stepped out of the comforting shadows. The yellow, dusty light of the stage caught the sharp, impeccable lines of his tailored suit. He walked with a slow, deliberate, metronomic cadence. Step, pause, step. Every movement was measured. Every footfall on the hardwood floor carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a man who owned the very ground he walked upon. Sal Vance heard the footsteps approaching from behind. He turned around, an irritated, ugly scowl twisting his greasy features. "Hey, I told the bartender it was last call 10 minutes ago," Sal snapped, assuming it was a lingering patron. "We're closing up, so finish your drink, pay your tab, and—" Sal's voice died in his throat. The words evaporated as if they had never existed. His eyes widened, bulging slightly against his skull in sheer panic. The smoldering cigar slipped from his slack, thick lips, falling to the floor and rolling a few inches before coming to a stop near Elias's kneeling leg. Sal knew exactly who was standing in front of him. Every grifter, every two-bit hustler, every arrogant club owner, and every corrupt cop in Harlem knew the face of Ellsworth Johnson. They knew the terrifying rumors. They knew the bloody history. They knew that men who disrespected Bumpy Johnson, or worse, disrespected the people Bumpy considered under his protection, tended to disappear into the cold, murky currents of the East River, or wake up in a damp alley with both of their hands shattered beyond repair. Mr. Johnson, Sal stammered. His arrogant bravado shattered instantly into a million pieces of sheer, unadulterated terror. He took a frantic, stumbling step backward, his lower back hitting the hard edge of the mahogany bar. He looked around wildly, suddenly realizing that the club was completely empty. I didn't know you were in tonight. My profound apologies. I didn't see you. The drinks are on the house, sir. Anything you want. Let me run to the back and get a fresh bottle of the good stuff. The imported stuff. Bumpy did not acknowledge Sal's existence. He didn't look at the trembling club owner. He kept his dark, intense eyes fixed downward, focusing entirely on the frail, dignified man still kneeling on the filthy floor. Bumpy walked right past Sal, his shoulder brushing the man's blue suit, and stepped over to Elias Thorne. He ignored the spilled beer, the muddy footprints, and the broken glass scattered nearby. Bumpy bent down smoothly, the expensive fabric of his trousers pulling tight over his knees, and reached out. His massive, incredibly powerful hands gently, almost tenderly, grasped Elias by the frail shoulders. "Let it go, Elias," Bumpy said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that carried an ocean of quiet respect. "That money is dirty. You don't need to touch it." Elias hesitated, his face turning upward toward the sound of the voice. He recognized the steady cadence, the authoritative timbre that he had heard a few times over the decades. "Mr. Johnson?" Elias whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It's me, old friend," Bumpy said softly. He pulled gently upward, his massive strength easily helping the elderly pianist rise from the sticky, humiliating floor. Bumpy reached down, picked up the scarred wooden cane, and placed it firmly back into Elias's shaking hand. Bumpy then took a crisp white silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and carefully brushed a few specks of dust and dirt off the shoulder of Elias's frayed tuxedo. "You played beautifully tonight, Elias," Bumpy said, ensuring his voice carried so Sal could hear every word. "Mamie would have loved it. She always told me you had the hands of an absolute angel. The city is lucky to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," Elias said, his voice regaining a fraction of its lost dignity as he stood taller, supported by Bumpy's presence. I was just trying to collect my wages before I left." "I know," Bumpy said, his voice completely calm. He turned his head slowly, tracking his gaze up to finally meet Sal Vance's wide, terrified eyes. The warmth that had been in Bumpy's voice for Elias vanished instantly, replaced by an arctic, suffocating chill that froze the blood. "It seems there was a slight misunderstanding regarding the accounting tonight." Sal was sweating profusely now. Heavy, cold beads of perspiration rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes and ruining his pomade. He wiped his face with the back of his trembling hand, leaving a greasy smear across his brow. "Mr. Johnson, please listen. It's just business," Sal pleaded, his voice cracking horribly. "The crowd was light tonight because of the storm. The register is practically empty. I swear to you, I was just trying to balance the books. You know how it is in this neighborhood. It's tough out here for an honest businessman." "Tough," Bumpy repeated softly. The words sounded less like an agreement and more like a death sentence falling from his lips. Bumpy released Elias's shoulder, giving it one last reassuring pat. He turned away from the bar, turned his back entirely on Sal Vance, and began to walk toward the front entrance of the club. He walked slowly past the empty booths, past the spilled drinks, past the heavy silence of the evacuated room. Sal watched him go, a wave of profound, dizzying relief washing over his entire body. His knees felt weak. He thought he had survived. He thought Bumpy was simply taking the high road, leading the blind man out, deciding that a low-level, pathetic club owner wasn't worth the effort of getting his expensive suit dirty. Sal let out a long, shaky breath, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He even managed to force a weak, incredibly nervous smile onto his face. "Have a very good night, Mr. Johnson," Sal called out, his voice echoing in the empty room, desperate to sound accommodating. "It's always an honor to have you in the Golden Clef. Please, bring your lovely wife next time. Drinks are always on me." Bumpy reached the front entrance. The heavy oak and frosted glass double doors stood closed tightly against the raging storm outside. Through the frosted glass, the rain lashed violently against the pane, distorting the streetlights into blurry, bleeding halos of yellow and red. Bumpy stopped. He didn't push the doors open. He didn't reach for the brass handles to step out into the freezing night with Elias. Instead, Bumpy reached up to the very top of the wooden frame. His gloved right hand slowly closed around the thick, heavy, solid brass deadbolt that secured the double doors from the inside. He looked over his right shoulder, locking his dark, unblinking eyes onto Sal Vance from across the room. Slowly, deliberately, Bumpy slid the heavy brass bolt all the way across the metal track. Clack. The sharp, heavy metallic sound echoed through the empty cavern of the club like the slamming of a steel prison door. Sal Vance's weak smile instantly vanished. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like a fresh corpse. The horrific realization hit him with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. Bumpy Johnson wasn't leaving. Bumpy Johnson was locking them in, and the only people left breathing in the room were a blind piano player, a silent, monstrous giant in a trench coat, the most dangerous, unforgiving man in New York City, and the fool who had just mocked a man under his protection. Bumpy turned entirely around to face the room. He stripped off his leather gloves, slipping them into his pocket before he took off his fedora, placed it carefully on the nearest empty table, and slowly began to unbutton his suit jacket. Sal heard the soft, expensive rustle of the charcoal gray English wool as Bumpy slid the suit jacket from his broad, heavy shoulders. The sound was incredibly quiet, completely dwarfed by the violent drumming of the freezing November rain against the frosted glass of the double doors. Yet to Sal Vance, it was the loudest noise in the world. It sounded like the sharp, rhythmic scraping of a gravedigger's shovel biting into hard dirt. Bumpy folded the jacket with the meticulous, unhurried care of a master tailor. He aligned the lapels perfectly, smoothing a microscopic, invisible wrinkle from the fabric before draping it gently over the back of a wooden chair. He did not look at Sal. He did not look at Junie Bird. His focus was entirely consumed by the simple, mundane task of preparing himself for work. With the jacket removed, the sheer physical mass of Ellsworth Johnson became terrifyingly apparent. He wore a pristine, starched white shirt that clung to the thick, corded muscles of his chest and arms, a physical testament to a life built on survival in the harshest environments America had to offer. He reached his massive right hand over to his left wrist and began to unfasten his silver cufflink. Click. The small piece of silver hit the wooden table. Bumpy rolled the crisp white cuff up to his forearm, revealing skin the color of dark, polished mahogany, etched with the faint, faded silver lines of old scars. scars earned in the legendary knife fights of his youth, long before he wore tailored suits, back when he carved his territory out of the Harlem concrete, one bloody inch at a time. Sal Vance could not breathe. His lungs felt as though they had been filled with wet cement. The cheap, offensive blue synthetic fabric of his suit was now thoroughly soaked with his own cold, foul-smelling sweat, clinging to his soft, trembling body like a second skin. He wanted to speak. He desperately wanted to scream for the police, to offer Bumpy free ownership of the club, to beg for his miserable life, but his throat had completely seized. His vocal cords were paralyzed by a primal, intoxicating dose of pure, unadulterated fear. Bumpy moved to his right wrist. He unfastened the second cufflink. Click. He rolled the right sleeve up, matching the left perfectly. He stood there for a long, agonizing moment, the dusty, yellow stage light catching the hard, flat planes of his face. He looked like an ancient bronze statue of a warlord that had suddenly, impossibly, drawn breath. "Mr. Johnson, please," Sal finally managed to choke out. The words scraped against the sides of his dry throat, sounding like the pathetic, high-pitched whimper of a trapped rat. I can fix this. Just tell me what you want. I'll give him the $30. I'll give him 50. Just, please, don't let your man hurt me." Bumpy did not answer. He slowly turned his head, his dark, heavy-lidded eyes panning across the empty, silent room until they locked onto Sal. The look contained no anger, no fiery rage, and no malice. It was entirely devoid of human emotion. It was the cold, clinical, detached stare of a scientist looking at a particularly repulsive insect through the thick glass of a microscope, debating whether or not to crush it, simply to see what color it. He began to walk back toward the mahogany bar. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and perfectly spaced. They echoed off the damp, water-stained ceiling of the Golden Clef, completely overriding the rhythm of the storm outside. With every step Bumpy took, Sal took a desperate, scrambling step backward until his spine crashed hard against the wooden shelves of the back bar, sending a tremor through the rows of cheap, watered-down liquor bottles. The glass clinked together, a chaotic, nervous chiming that betrayed the absolute stillness of the rest of the room. "You mentioned business earlier, Sal," Bumpy said. His deep, gravelly voice rolled through the humid air, wrapping around Sal's neck like a thick, rough hemp rope. "You told me that shortchanging a blind, elderly man out of $20 was simply the cost of doing business in my neighborhood." Bumpy stopped exactly 3 feet away from the trembling club owner. He reached out and casually picked up the heavy crystal glass of scotch that Sal had abandoned on the counter. Bumpy held the glass up to the dim light, rotating it slowly, examining the cheap amber liquid as it swirled around the melting ice cubes. "I know a great deal about business," Bumpy continued, his tone conversational, yet laced with a lethal, icy undercurrent. "I know about ledgers, I know about margins, and I know about the delicate balance of investments. But the most important thing I have learned in my 40 years on these streets is the concept of value." "Do you understand what value is, Sal?" Sal shook his head frantically, his greasy, pomade-slicked hair falling into his terrified, bulging eyes. "Yes, sir. No, sir. Whatever you say it is, Mr. Johnson." "Value," Bumpy said, placing the glass back onto the sticky wood of the bar with a definitive heavy thud, "is not dictated by the amount of green paper folded inside that cheap silver clip in your breast pocket. Value is what a man brings to his community. Value is what a man leaves behind when he walks out of a room." Bumpy slowly turned slightly, gesturing with a massive, open hand toward the center of the room, where Elias Thorne stood. The frail, blind pianist was standing perfectly still, his chin raised, leaning on his scarred wooden cane. He was listening intently to the exchange, his face a mask of quiet, profound dignity. "That man," Bumpy said, his voice lowering an octave, vibrating with a deep, fierce, protective respect. "That man possesses more value in his gnarled, arthritic little finger than you could accumulate in 10 lifetimes. When Elias Thorne sits at that piano, he takes the pain, the exhaustion, and the bitter cold of this city, and he transmutes it into gold. He gives the people of Harlem an hour of peace. He gives them a reminder of their own humanity. He provides a service of the soul." Bumpy stepped an inch closer to Sal. The smell of Bumpy's expensive bay rum completely overpowered the stench of Sal's nervous sweat and cheap floral cologne. "And you," Bumpy whispered, leaning in so close that Sal could see the faint, pulsing blue vein in the center of Bumpy's forehead. "You are a parasite. You are a fat, bloated tick burrowed deep into the skin of my avenue. You water down the gin, you skim the wages of your waitstaff, and you believe that because you hold a lease to this damp, miserable basement, you are a king." Sal whimpered, a wet, pathetic sound. Tears began to well up in the corners of his eyes, mixing with the heavy grease on his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was just joking with him, Mr. Johnson. It was just a stupid jive joke. I have a bad sense of humor." "A joke," Bumpy repeated softly, tasting the word, rejecting it instantly. From the shadows near the front door, Junie Bard moved. Junie did not run. He simply glided forward, covering the distance from the entrance to the bar with terrifying speed. He stepped up beside Bumpy, looming over the bar like a massive, dark storm cloud. Junie did not look at Bumpy for permission. They possessed a telepathic understanding forged in decades of warfare. Junie reached across the mahogany counter, his giant calloused hand moving faster than Sal's eyes could track. Junie's fingers closed around the lapels of Sal's bright blue suit. With a single, effortless jerk of his massive arm, Junie lifted Sal Vance completely off his two-tone wingtip shoes. Sal gasped, his toes dangling a full 3 inches above the sticky floorboards. The fabric of his cheap suit groaned and tore slightly at the seams under the immense, crushing strain of Junie's grip. "Junie," Bumpy said softly, raising a single finger. Junie froze instantly. He held the 200-pound club owner suspended in the air with zero visible effort, his flat, dead eyes staring directly through Sal's terrified face. "Put him down," Bumpy ordered calmly. "We are gentlemen. We do not ruin a man's suit unless he refuses to listen to reason." Junie opened his hand. Sal dropped like a stone, his heavy leather shoes slamming into the floorboards with a loud, clumsy clatter. His knees buckled immediately, and he collapsed against the front of the bar, gasping frantically for air, clutching his chest as if he had just suffered a massive coronary. "Now," Bumpy said, looking down at the crumpled, shivering mess of a man, "we are going to correct the balance of the universe. Step 1 of this transaction requires a demonstration of genuine remorse." Bumpy pointed a single, long finger across the room. "You are going to walk over to Elias Thorne. You are going to look him in his face. And you are going to apologize. You are going to explain to him that you are a fool, a coward, and a failure of a man. You will beg for his forgiveness with the sincerity of a sinner at the gates of hell." Sal looked up, his eyes darting between the stone-cold face of Bumpy Johnson and the terrifying, silent silhouette of Junie Bard. his pride, the fragile, toxic ego that had allowed him to mock a blind man just 10 minutes ago, flickered briefly in his chest. The idea of apologizing to an old, penniless musician in his own club felt like a physical wound. He hesitated, taking a shaky breath, his mind desperately searching for a way to negotiate, a way to save face. It was the worst mistake of his life. Junie Bird did not need an order for hesitation. Junie simply took one single heavy step forward. That one step was all it took. The sheer radiating intent of violence rolling off Junie's frame shattered the last remaining fragment of Sal's ego into fine dust. Okay, I'll do it. Sal screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched sob. He pushed himself off the bar, his legs wobbling uncontrollably like a newborn calf. He stumbled forward, moving away from the safety of the mahogany counter and out into the open floor. He walked past the scattered empty tables, his eyes fixed on the dignified, silent figure of Elias Thorne. Every step felt like walking through deep, sucking mud. When he reached the center of the room, standing 3 feet away from the blind man, Sal stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. Bumpy was standing at the bar, his arms resting casually on the polished wood, watching with the unblinking intensity of a hawk. Junie stood right beside him, a monument to impending doom. "Down," Bumpy commanded. The single word cracked through the quiet room like the snap of a leather bullwhip. Sal Vance sobbed openly now. The tears carved clean streaks through the grime and grease on his cheeks. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his heavy body downward. His knees hit the filthy, sticky floorboards. The wet spilled beer and the stale cigarette ash soaked instantly into the fabric of his trousers. He was kneeling in the exact same spot, in the exact same humiliating position that he had forced Elias into only moments before. Elias Thorne stood tall. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply gripped his wooden cane with both hands, resting his weight upon it, his face turned slightly downward toward the sound of Sal's heavy, ragged breathing. "Mr. Thorne," Sal choked out, his voice trembling so violently the words were barely intelligible. He stared down at the dirty floor, entirely unable to look at the blind man's face. "Look at him." Bumpy's voice boomed from the bar, filling the cavernous room, echoing with the authority of a judge handing down a life sentence. Sal snapped his head up, his neck muscles straining. He looked into the dark, thick lenses of Elias's sunglasses. "Mr. Thorne," Sal repeated, the tears falling freely onto his expensive silk tie. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I am a fool. I am a coward. I was wrong to disrespect you. I was wrong to mock your music. You are a great man. I am nothing but a cheap, worthless hustler. Please, forgive my ignorance. I beg you." The silence that followed was heavier than lead. The only sound in the entire world was the relentless drumming of the storm against the roof, threatening to wash the entire building into the sewers. Elias Thorne stood silently for a long moment, letting the apology hang in the damp air. He possessed a grace that could not be taught, a forgiveness that was entirely alien to the brutal mechanics of the Harlem underworld. "Your apology is heard, Mr. Vance," Elias said, his voice raspy, calm, and utterly devoid of venom, "and it is accepted. I harbor no hatred in my heart for you. Hatred is a heavy burden to carry, and my shoulders are far too old for it." Sal let out a massive, shuddering breath, a horrific combination of a sob and a sigh of relief. He slumped forward slightly, believing the ordeal was over. He had eaten the dirt. He had swallowed his pride. He believed he had paid his debt to the King of Harlem. "Beautiful," Bumpy said from the bar. Sal turned his head, looking back toward the shadows. Bumpy was slowly, methodically rolling his crisp white sleeves down, completely unbothered by the emotional display. "That was a very touching step one, Sal," Bumpy said, his voice returning to its calm, conversational, icy tone. "But as any good businessman knows, an apology without financial restitution is just empty jive. It pays no rent. It buys no bread." Sal scrambled frantically to his feet, his wet, sticky trousers clinging to his legs. He reached desperately into his inner pocket and pulled out the thick silver money clip. He fumbled with it, his slick, sweaty fingers trying to peel away the bills. Yes, of course, Mr. Johnson. The money. The $30. Right here. I have it right here. Put that pocket change away, you absolute clown. Bumpy snapped, the sudden sharpness in his voice causing Sal to flinch as if he had been physically struck. Bumpy walked slowly around the edge of the bar, stepping out into the main floor. He pointed his long finger toward the swinging wooden doors that led to the back of the club. "We are not dealing in crumpled dollar bills from your pocket, Sal. We are conducting official business, and official business is conducted in the office. Walk." Sal shoved the money clip back into his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he nearly missed the opening entirely. He turned and practically sprinted toward the swinging doors, terrified that if he moved too slowly, Junie Bird would materialize behind him and snap his spine. He burst through the doors into a short, dimly lit hallway that smelled strongly of mold, bleach, and old garbage, leading directly to his private office. Bumpy followed at a slow, measured pace. Junie brought up the rear, his heavy boots making no sound on the linoleum floor of the hallway. Elias remained standing near the stage, perfectly safe, completely untouched by the radiating terror. Sal threw open the door to his office and stumbled inside. The room was a pathetic, transparent reflection of the man who occupied it. It was small, cramped, and aggressively gaudy. The walls were covered in cheap, dark red velvet wallpaper that was peeling at the corners. A heavy fake mahogany desk dominated the space, covered in disorganized stacks of invoices, dirty highball glasses, and overflowing ashtrays. Behind the desk, bolted clumsily to the floor, sat a heavy black iron safe. Bumpy stepped into the doorway, filling the frame completely. Junie stood right behind him, effectively sealing the only exit. "Open it," Bumpy commanded quietly. Sal scrambled behind the desk. He dropped to his knees in front of the heavy iron safe, his hands violently shaking as he reached for the chrome combination dial. His mind was a chaotic blur of panic. He couldn't remember the numbers. His brain, suffocated by terror, simply refused to function. "3," Bumpy said slowly, pulling a silver pocket watch from his vest and clicking it open. "2. I got it. Sal screamed, the adrenaline finally forcing his memory to engage. He spun the dial left, right, then left again. His sweaty fingers slipped off the chrome twice, but he managed to catch the final number. He grabbed the heavy iron handle and threw his weight backward. Clank. The heavy door swung open, revealing the dark interior. Inside sat 3 neat stacks of bound bills, the accumulated profits of watered-down liquor, underpaid staff, and desperate gamblers. It was perhaps $4,000 or $5,000 in total. To Sal, it was his life savings. To Bumpy, it was a rounding error on a Tuesday afternoon. "Take it all out," Bumpy ordered. "Put it on the desk." Sal hesitated for a fraction of a second, his greed momentarily battling his terror. He looked at the stacks of cash, the physical manifestation of his pathetic kingdom. Then He looked up at Junie Bird's completely empty, soulless eyes. Greed lost immediately. Sal reached in, his hands trembling, as he grabbed the stacks of banded bills. He placed them onto the cluttered, sticky surface of the desk, knocking over an ashtray and sending a cloud of gray ash into the stale air. Bumpy walked into the room. He stepped up to the desk, looking down at the money with an expression of profound boredom. Elias Thorne played his soul out on that stage for 3 hours, Bumpy said, his voice dangerously soft. The agreed-upon rate was $30, but due to the extreme emotional distress you intentionally caused him, the horrific public humiliation he suffered, and the late hour of payment, the union rate has drastically increased. The penalty for being a racist, arrogant square in my city is exceptionally high. Bumpy looked across the desk at Sal's sweating, pale face. You owe Mr. Thorne $90. Count it out. Sal didn't argue. He didn't breathe. He simply reached forward, his slick fingers tearing the paper band off the first stack of 20s. He counted frantically, peeling the bills off the top and slapping them onto the wood. 20, 40, 60, 80. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a crumpled 10 to make the difference. 90. Exactly $90, Mr. Johnson. Bumpy stared at the small pile of money, then nodded slowly. You are a fast learner, Sal. Pick it up, walk out there, place it respectfully into his hand, and thank him for his patience. Sal grabbed the $90, clutching it like a lifeline. He scurried out from behind the desk, squeezed past the massive, immovable frame of Junie Bird in the doorway, and rushed down the short hallway back into the main room of the club. Bumpy followed, leaning against the doorframe, watching the transaction. Sal approached Elias, who was still waiting patiently near the stage. Sal reached out, his hand shaking, and gently placed the folded bills into Elias's waiting palm. Mr. Thorne, Sal said, his voice stripped of all arrogance, hollowed out by fear. Here is your pay, $90. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for the beautiful music. Elias felt the thickness of the bills. He knew immediately it was more than 30, but he did not question it. He simply nodded his head. Thank you, Mr. Vance. I will take my leave now. Elias turned, tapping his heavy cane against the floorboards, and began to make his way slowly toward the front door. Sal let out a massive, exhausted sigh, leaning against the nearest table for support. It was over. The nightmare had concluded. He had lost $90 and his pride, but he was alive. He looked toward the back hallway, expecting to see Bumpy and Junie heading for the exit. Instead, Bumpy Johnson walked slowly out of the hallway, carrying the remaining cash from the safe in his massive left hand. Sal's eyes bulged out of his skull. His heart, which had just begun to slow down, instantly spiked into a terrifying, erratic rhythm. Mr. Johnson, sir? What are you doing with that? Bumpy stopped in the center of the room. He casually slipped the thousands of dollars into the deep inner pocket of his tailored trousers. He looked at Sal, a slow, incredibly cold, completely devoid of humor smile spreading across his face. I told you, Sal, Bumpy said, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying register. I know about ledgers. I know about balancing the books. You paid Elias his wages and his penalty. That cleared your debt to him. Bumpy took a slow, deliberate step forward. But you insulted a man under the protection of Mamie Johnson. You disrespected an elder of Harlem in a club that operates on my avenue. That means you incurred a debt to the community. And you incurred a debt to me. But that's everything. Sal screamed, panic finally overriding his instinct for self-preservation. That's my operating capital. That's my rent. That's my liquor order. You're breaking me. You can't just take it. I can, Bumpy said softly, the smile vanishing instantly, replaced by a mask of absolute unforgiving stone. "And I have. Consider this a fine, Sal. A tax levied against your profound stupidity. This money will go to the St. Martin's soup kitchen tomorrow morning. It will feed the people you prey upon." Sal lunged forward, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim his life savings. He took exactly 1.5 steps before a shadow eclipsed him completely. Junie Bird moved with the speed of a striking cobra. Junie didn't punch Sal. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached out his massive, calloused right hand and grabbed Sal's right hand out of the air. Junie's thick fingers wrapped completely around Sal's soft, manicured hand, encompassing it entirely, locking it into a vice grip of bone and muscle. Junie squeezed. He didn't squeeze to break. He squeezed just to the absolute precipice of the breaking point. The pressure was unimaginable, a slow, grinding, terrifying compression of flesh and cartilage. Sal dropped to his knees instantly, letting out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that tore through his vocal cords. The pain shot up his arm, setting his entire nervous system on fire. He felt the small bones in his hand grinding painfully against one another, bowing under the immense, unnatural pressure. He looked up, his eyes wide with absolute, blinding agony, staring into Junie Bird's dead, unblinking eyes. "You insulted a man's hands tonight, Cat," Junie whispered. His voice was so quiet, so devoid of emotion, it was infinitely more terrifying than a scream. You mocked the magic in his fingers. Let this be a reminder of how fragile your own magic really is. Junie held the agonizing pressure for 3 endless, suffocating seconds. Sal was hyperventilating, his vision going black around the edges, entirely convinced his bones were going to shatter into powder. Then, exactly a microsecond before the bones snapped, Junie let go. Sal collapsed onto the sticky floor, curling into the fetal position, cradling his throbbing, bruised hand against his chest, sobbing uncontrollably into the dirty wood. He was a completely broken, hollowed-out shell of a man. Bumpy walked over to the table where he had left his clothing. He picked up his crisp, white-folded cuffs and calmly fastened the silver links. He picked up his charcoal gray jacket, sliding it smoothly over his broad shoulders, adjusting the lapels perfectly. He pulled his leather gloves from his pocket, sliding them onto his massive hands with deliberate precision. Finally, he picked up his fedora and placed it on his head, pulling the brim down low over his dark eyes. He walked slowly over to the front entrance, where Elias Thorne was standing patiently by the double doors, waiting to be let out into the storm. Bumpy reached up to the top of the heavy wooden frame. His gloved hand closed around the thick brass deadbolt. He looked back over his shoulder one final time. Sal Vance was still on the floor, weeping openly, a pathetic, ruined pile of cheap blue fabric and shattered ego. "You will keep this club open, Sal," Bumpy commanded, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "You will serve honest liquor. You will pay your staff a fair wage, and if Elias Thorne ever wishes to play that piano again, you will pay him $50 a night in advance, and you will address him as Sir. If I ever hear a whisper, a single rumor on the wind, that you have reverted to your parasitic ways." Bumpy let the threat hang in the cold air, completely unspoken, but entirely understood. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The absolute terror radiating from Sal Vance confirmed that the lesson had been permanently burned into his soul. Bumpy slid the heavy brass bolt back across the track. Clack. The lock disengaged. Bumpy pushed the heavy double doors open, letting the freezing, violent Harlem storm rush into the stagnant, suffocating air of the club. The wind howled, a beautiful, cleansing sound. "Come, Elias," Bumpy said softly, placing a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder. "My driver will take you home. The rain is entirely too cold for a man of your profound talents." They walked out into the dark, wet neon glow of 125th Street, the king of Harlem and the blind master of the keys, leaving the ruined, whimpering club owner locked alone in the prison of his own making, the doors completely wide open, but Sal Vance too terrified to ever truly leave.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.